This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
So we're discussing the topic of miftais, different pronunciations. And last week we were speaking about the advantages of the way the Ashkenazim pronounce the words, the advantages of the way the Sefardim pronounce the words. We saw from Rav Henkin and the Yedus L'Yisrael that Rav Henkin writes that the Sefardim are more accurate in terms of the way they pronounce the oisiyos. Right? Rav Henkin said that the Ashkenazim don't pronounce the difference between the ayin and the aleph, the tuf and the tes, the saf and the samach, the vez and the vav, the kuf and the kaf, the hey and the ches, and so forth. Rav Henkin went so far as to say that the teachers, the Rabbeim and yeshivos, they're obligated to go study the pronunciation of letters from the Sefardim. On the other hand, we saw from Rabbeinu B'chaye, who Rav Yaakov Emden says was one of them. Rav Yaakov Emden says if you pronounce Adoi and then Noi, Ado and then Nai, you're destroying the world. So the way, typically, many people say the name of Hashem is a terrible thing. That's what Rabbeinu B'chaye writes. So we have the advantages and disadvantages of both pronunciations. And now the question is, are you allowed to switch? Are you allowed to switch? So, we're going to start in number 12 from the Shas Chuvas Minchas Yitzchak, Dayan Weiss. And Dayan Weiss writes like this. The first thing he does is he quotes the Magen Avram. Magen Avram, you look at number 7. Magen Avram quotes the Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi says like this. On the second line in the Magen Avram in Siman Samaches, the Magen Avram says, V'zel Lashon HaGemara Yerushalmi, Af al pi sheshilachnu lachem seder hatfilos, even though Anshe Knesset Hagdola have already arranged for you the order of davening, al tishanu minhag avosecha. Don't change your minhag. So what is Magen Avram talking about? Even though Chazal have already given you the order of davening, don't change from the minhag. What minhag is the Yerushalmi telling you not to change from? Says the Minchas Yitzchak, what the Yerushalmi means to say is, even though you know what to daven, but how you pronounce the words, you're not allowed to change. That's how the Minchas Yitzchak understands the Magen Avram. So he writes like this. He writes, if you look in the first column, this is on page 3 from the Minchas Yitzchak, the first word on the line is ba'am, in paragraph aleph, about 15 lines down. He says, V'emkein, kivan shekabalas avaisenu biyadenu hi hamiftah ha'ashkenazis. Since our tradition is, he's talking to Ashkenazim, our tradition is to pronounce words the way the Ashkenazim do. And this is a tradition that dates back at least 1,000 years. At least 1,000 years. V'yein biyadenu l'shanos miminhag avosenu kimavor b'Yerushalmi. So if the Yerushalmi is telling you, you're not allowed to change from the way your forefathers pronounced the words, so you say, fine, but what's the difference? Does it really matter if I say Baruch or Baruch? Does it matter how I say it? So says the Minchas Yitzchak, you have to know the Rambam. The Rambam says about Hilchos Kriya Shema, look at number 13. The Rambam Hilchos Kriya Shema in Parak Beis Halacha Ches writes, V'tzarech ledaktek v'oisi yosef. You have to be very exacting in the pronunciation of the letters. V'im loy diktek, but yet if you we're not exact yatsa, you're still yatsa. But still the Rambam's saying you have to be careful how you pronounce the words. So even though we don't know which one is necessarily more correct, but since we have to maintain the tradition of our forefathers, if we're going to change from Ashkenazis to Sefardic, it could be we're in violation of what the Rambam says, that we're karav loy diktek v'oisi. In other words, if our grandfather, who lived in Poland, would hear us pronouncing words like a Sephardi, he'd be turning over in his grave. He'd be saying, that's not how we pronounce in the Altahaim. So even though we're not 100% sure that's the correct way to do it, but since you can't change, you run the risk of violating what the Rambam says, karav loy diktek v'oisi. In other words, we don't know. So therefore we have to maintain status quo. And if you change status quo, says the Minchas Yitzchak, you're violating what the Rambam says, that karav loy diktek v'oisi. And to top it off, he goes to bat. He says to top it off, the Ashkenazim, if you're going to weigh out, he writes, who has it more correct? The Sefardic pronunciation of the letters, which we said is more correct, or the Ashkenazic pronunciation of the Nekudas, which is more correct, the advantage of the Ashkenazim far, far, far outweighs the advantage of the Sefardim. That's what he writes. And therefore, for an Ashkenazi to switch to Sephardi is the wrong thing to do. Especially because he says, Rabbeinu Bechaye, who was a Sephardi, acknowledged the fact that the Sephardim are destroying the name of Hashem. So therefore, to switch over is a major problem. Okay, that's the opinion of the Minchas Yitzchak. And what we saw last week. Rabbi say, we are now going to discuss something along the same lines, and that is, well, in Eretz Yisrael today, the lingo on the street, the language they speak on the street, they're not speaking Yiddish in the streets of Israel, in the streets of Eretz Yisrael. They're speaking modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is what the Minchas Yitzchak calls a corruption in every sense of Hebrew, because it takes the worst of Havara Ashkenaz, it's the worst of Havara Sefardic. It takes the bad pronunciation of the Ashkenazim of the Oisios, takes the bad pronunciation of the Sefardim of the Nekudos, and trying to take all the corruptions from every dialect, it has created this great corruption called modern Hebrew, says the Minchas Yitzchak. So now the question is, but that language is closer to Havara Sefardic than it is to Ashkenazis. And every kid in the world, even a Haredi in Israel, when they go to the supermarket, they're not saying, Ani roitze leilech. They're not speaking like an Ashkenazi when they're talking in the street. They're speaking modern Hebrew. So now the question is, if anyway 99% of the things that they're saying are in modern Hebrew, and even when they're hearing Shiur in Yeshiva Gedolos, many Charedim are learning Behavara Sefardic, so then naturally, are they allowed to start speaking, davening and learning, reading the Torah with that pronunciation? Okay, that's the question. That's the question. So what are the issues at hand?
Is the union only related to davening or speaking that Lashon?
You want to speak that Lashon, it's not any better or any worse than Japanese.
Is fine. When it comes to davening,
yeah, we're talking about davening here, right? We're not going to get into politics here, right? We're talking about davening and learning, okay? Are you allowed to, is somebody allowed to switch over his pronunciation to Havara Sefardic, or the Havara that they speak in Eretz Yisrael? Okay. So really, very interestingly, the first to discuss this were two Gedolei Yisrael, and really everybody who comes after them quotes them unabashedly, without writing, oh, I heard in the name of someone and I'm not going to mention his name. All the Gedolei Yisrael come after quote them openly, whether it's the Minchas Yitzchak himself. The Minchas Yitzchak himself quotes over here. Well, we'll see. So if the Gedolei Yisrael are unabashedly bring this all down, then we should not be any different. And that is the first to discuss this were Rav Uziel and Rav Kook. And Rav Uziel, who's Rav Uziel? Rav Ben Sion Meir Chai Uziel was one of the first chief rabbis of Israel for the Sefardim. And when he wrote his many volumes of tshuvas, he asked for haskama from Rav Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. And Rav Kook gave him a haskama. The only problem was, Rav Kook said he disagrees with the basic premise of his Sefer. And Rav Uziel discusses the following issue. Okay, this is very hard to find this tshuva, so eventually I had to get someone who had Oitzra HaChachma. And Rav Uziel, it is Shas HaTshuvas Mishpatei Uziel, Chelek Aleph, Simin Aleph. Okay? And number 18, it's on the 5th sheet. And we're going to turn for a moment to page 6. Page 6. And now the question is like this. When my grandfather ate chicken soup Friday night, he ate kreplach. Am I allowed to eat matzah balls in my chicken soup? Or there's no, it's minhag. It's a minhag in my mishpacha to have kreplach Friday night. My grandfather had 2 carrots on his gefilte fish. With the piece of lettuce underneath. Am I allowed to have only 1 carrot? My grandfather never put mayonnaise in the chrein. Never. Am I allowed to? What is minhag? Is minhag everything? They didn't do this, so, right? They didn't use electricity either. So what's the definition of a minhag, right? Because it says in Mishlei, Shema b'ni musar avicha. Listen to the musar of your father. Fine, that I got. My father gives me musar, you gotta listen. V'al titosh Torah asimecha. Don't forsake the Torah of your mother. What Torah of your mother? Your mother is not learning Torah. Right? Women are not commanded in Torah. In fact, the Gemara says you're not allowed to teach your daughter many aspects of the Torah. So what is Shlomo HaMelech saying? V'al titosh Torah asimecha. Presumably, there's an area of halacha that even though it's not mamish halacha, but it's the mama Torah. It's what your mother used to do. If your mother did something, don't change. Yeah, but my mother didn't do it because it's a halacha. Yeah, but still, there's a messiah for it. There's a tradition for it. Is there such a concept? Is there a concept that even though there's no halacha that I have to do it, but I should continue doing it because my mother did it or my father did it? Is there such a thing in halacha?
Minhag Yisrael Torah.
What does Minhag Yisrael Torah mean?
Oh, they say Minhag Zotil Genam.
That's right. Rabbi Vadia quotes that a lot, right? What Minhag Yisrael Torah? My Zayda, in Iran, Iraq, they used to wear skirts.
Yeah.
Right? So now what? Now what do I do? So what does it mean, Minhag Yisrael Torah? What's Minhag Yisrael? Fine. Theata, so now we're going to see Rabbi Uziel quotes a famous tshuva, the tshuva of the Maharashdam. And the Maharashdam is talking about a case where in a certain kehillah, even though it was Ashkenazim, but the whole location for many, many years was davening Nusach Sfard. And then a few stalwarts got up and said, what's going on here? We're Ashkenazim. Why are we davening Nusach Sfard? Let's revert back to our original tradition. So take a look, page 6, Sif Beis, the last column, the left-hand column, where it says Sif Beis. You see that? V'yata nehedar anpeh. Now let's turn our face. Levarer v'ladon. To clarify, im yesh b'shinoi hamivtaim, if by changing your pronunciation, misham al titosh tairasimecha, is that a violation of don't forsake the Mama's Torah? Oy sha'al avicha v'yagecha shezel yisoid kol taras haminhagim. That's the founding principle of all minhag. Says Rav Uziel, ani as daiti nira she'im b'zeh kol tzad iser. There's no iser. If my grandfather pronounced it oi and I changed to o, or my grandfather pronounced it o and I changed to oi, the minhag zeh ikaroi eino dvar iser, because we're not dealing with iser v'heter. Chumash sheichachnu el midin karv le'digva yisrael yatsa. Harei shegam b'makom shenagu b'mifta zeh ayachar lo yechmiru b'lamer shemkar shema b'mifta acher v'shaloi b'dik shaloi yatsa. Says Rav Uziel, however you read it, you're going to fulfill the mitzvah. Whether you say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elok, or you say Shema Yisrael, well, however you say it, you're getting the mitzvah. So if however you say you're getting the mitzvah, you're not dealing with matters of Isser v'Heter. Says Rabbi Uziel, v'kivan shekain ein bebitel minhag zeh mishum al titosh Torah simach. You hear this? There's no concept of minhag if it's not dealing with Isser v'Heter. Just because your father ate gefilte fish, you can eat white fish. Just because your father ate sour chrein, you could put mayonnaise in the chrein. Your father drank seltzer, you could drink Coca-Cola. They never drank Coca-Cola. That's not part of Judaism. Minhag is Isser v'Heter. If your father didn't eat gebrakst, why didn't he? Because he was worried maybe it's chametz. So even though maybe technically you're allowed to, but if he did something because of an Isser or of a Chash Isser, that's a minhag that's binding. But just something that he did, my father wore size 12 shoes, but I can't fit into size 12 shoes, I'm a size 9. So I have to wear the same size shoes as my father? My father's hat was a size 11. I put it would be under my chin. So you don't have to do every single thing your father does. When is it binding? If it's a matter of Isser v'Heter. How do I know this? So Uziel, it's the famous tshuva of the Maharashdam. V'chein kasa Maharashdam zal b'tshuvaisa. This is very important. Leimatzanu v'loi ro'inu. We don't find and we don't see. She'en l'shanois minhag avoseinu. That you're not allowed to change the minhag of your fathers. Kiyim b'davar sheyesh bo nidnud iser. That's only if it's something you're worried about, if it's mutter or aser. Like in the Gemara Pesachim. Avol ki hai gavna. But to switch from Nusach Ashkenaz to Nusach Sfard, V'leka tzad iser klal. Ve'ikar. V'loi harchakas avera. Either one is just as far away from avera as the other. V'hapshita d'loi shayich ve'mishum al titosh tarsimach. Says Rav Uziel, what's the difference whether you daven Ashkenaz Sefardic? It's just the way they used to do it. You don't have to continue to do things the way they used to do it. If it's a matter of they davened a certain way because they wanted to keep away from people who are making innovations, reform, or so forth. Anything that Klal Yisrael did because they were choishish for Isser, even if it's just a Farad Chash, you have to continue to do. But just because they used to do things this way, we don't have to continue doing them. That's what the Marashtam writes. Chida says Marashtam, we accept what he says like the words of the Rambam. Marashtam was one of the Gedolei HaPoskim of the Kadmonim. So the first thing says Rebbe Uziel, to say you can't switch because the Zayda pronounced it a certain way, pronunciation does not enter the realm of Al Titosh Tarasinach. More than that, he invokes what we said, the Chassam Sofer said in the name of his Rebbe, Rav Nosson Adler. Rav Nosson Adler hired Rav Chaim Odino to come from Yerushalayim to Germany to teach him how to pronounce Hebrew like a Sefardi. Certainly Rav Nosson Adler would never violate Al Titosh Torah Simecha. But Rav Nosson Adler's father didn't pronounce it like a Sefardi. The answer is Rav Nosson Adler's father also liked chicken soup and he liked vegetable soup. That's what Rav Uziel is saying. And more than that, says Rav Uziel, what about the Sefer Hasidim? Look at number 17. Sefer Hasidim writes, B'chlal, what about people, they can't pronounce words properly. You have some people, they can't pronounce hey, right? I mean, excuse me, ches, right? So they say Hanukkah, right? Hala, right? And then they get confused, so they don't even know when a hey is a ches. So they train themselves that every hey is a ches. Somebody asked me, how do you do the mitzvah of chaf rosh haschala? It's half rosh haschala, right? People aren't able to distinguish. So what? How do those people daven? When they get up to the pasuk, Nafshenu chiksa Lashem. You know what they say? Nafshenu chiksa Lashem. Our soul smacks kaviyachal. So what do? Right? Nafshenu says the Sefer Chasidim, Rabbi Yehuda Achas. Look at number 17. Im yipla be'einecha. If it's wondrous in your eyes, al oisam ha'megamgim b'lashon. Those who stumble, v'karin l'ches hey, they call a ches hey. The l'shin samach, they call a shina samach, right? The Litvaks, right? The Taz writes about the people who can't pronounce the difference between a shin and a sin. Ulakuf tes, right? We don't mean anything derogatory. Just this is a matter of fact. With those who call a kuf a tes and a reish a dalet. Eich mispalalim, oyich karma Torah, oyimim davar shukdusha. Kishemagiyim lenafshenu chiksa. When they get to the pasuk, nafshenu chiksa, right? What do they say? Lo nimtzu mecharfim megafim. Says the Sefer Hasidim, don't be such a stick. Don't get so caught up in details. Al tisma ala chefetz. Who do you think you're davening to? The King of England. It's Rebbeinu Shalom. You think he really cares? Ki boireinu. Look what he writes. Asher hu boichein libais. Hashem's looking at your heart. Einoi shoyel kiyim lev ha'adam. All Hashem asks for is what's in your heart. Asher yiyah tamim imay. And if you don't know how to speak properly, you could be stumbling and mumbling, and when it goes up to Shemayim, Hashem hears what you would like to say, not what you're actually saying. Some people, they say Psukei de Zimra, they don't read the words properly. Listen to this. Tfilasam uzmirusam miskabel kareach nichayach. Even though they can't read Hebrew, even though it sounds like they're reading Japanese, Hashem treats it like a fragrant aroma. V'gam HaKadosh Baruch Hu samach alav simcha gedola. Hashem rejoices over it greatly. V'omer kamahu mizamer lefanim v'nidayt. Hashem says, it's like, your child. You have a baby, 2 years old. They ask you for something. It's unintelligible. If anybody else would hear it, they wouldn't know what the child means. But the parent understands. And not only does the parent understand, he enjoys it. He loves it. It's sweet to him. So too, when the Rebbeinu Shalom hears us daven, even if though, says the Sefer Chazim, it might be a mumble jumble, Hashem knows what we want, and exactly the details are not critical. Like the pasuk says, "V'digloi olai ahava," right? That even our mistakes are accepted with love before the Rebbe Shalom. So says Rabbi Uziel, take a look at number 18, back on page 6. Rabbi Uziel in the middle column, in the paragraph that begins, Meha Amor Yaitse, Din Baruch comes out clear, Sheshanoi Hamavtam, Enam Garmim, even if we grant that he's making a mistake, it doesn't matter, lahalacha. And however you read it, whatever havara you choose, as long as you're consistent, it's beloved in the eyes of Hashem. So to say you can't change from one to the other, you can't say you can't change from one to the other. To say it's a violation of al titosh Torah simecha, it's not a violation of al titosh Torah simecha. And then Rabbi Uziel throws in for good measure that to say you can't change to Havara Sefardic when Rav Nosson Adler changed, I mean, how could you argue with that? And then he adds another idea that whoever's changing to this Havara, it's not because they're trying to leave and throw off the yoke of what their parents used to do. It's because in Eretz Yisrael, that's the language that's spoken on the street, even by Yereim Ushleimim, he says. So if that's how they speak the rest of the day, to say that they can't daven and learn like that, if they're only doing it to be consistent with the way they speak, and they're not trying to, like the Minchas Yitzchak would say, well, people are doing it, they're trying to adopt a new culture. Rabbi Uziel has a different take on it, that they're just trying to speak however they speak the rest of the day. And therefore he says, it's certainly not a violation of Al Titosh Torah Simecha. But what is the main halachic principle that Rabbi Uziel's psak is based on? The famous tshuva of Marashdam. And this is a tshuva everybody should know. That what is the definition of not changing from your parents' minhag? If your father did something because he was worried about Navera, even if it was a very far out couch, then you have Isser V'Heter, you must continue. If it's just what he did, it's not a matter of, one is not bound by that minhag.
So the Rambam said it dakdek.
So Razi is saying, but you're still Yatza. So if you're still Yatza,
how Yatza if you don't dakdek?
The Rambam says, Tzarech l'dakdek v'yiseh, v'im kara v'loi dikdek Yatza. Rav Kook wrote a haskama to the Shas Chuvas Mishpatei Uziel, and in his hakdama, he takes issue with this psak. Very interesting letter. Look at number 15. This comes from the Michtav Bracha that Rav Kook wrote for the Shas Chuvas Mishpatei Uziel, and it was later published in a journal and in Rav Kook's own Sefer, and he writes the following.
Which number again?
This is number 15. Says Rav Kook, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first chief rabbi, he writes like this. By the way, Rav Hutner used to say, Rav Hutner was a Talmud of Slobodka, but Rav Hutner was also a Talmud of Rav Kook. He says the first floor of his building came from the Alter of Slobodka. The second floor of his building came from Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. Okay. Rav Kook was Rabbi Yoshev Shadchan. Okay, and he was also a very close Talmud of the Leshem. The Leshem was the author of Leshem Shvai Ve'achlama, the grandfather of Rabbi Yoshev. Okay, so he writes like this. To invoke the psak of the Marashdam has absolutely nothing to do with the issue at hand. Why not? It says like this. What's the Marashdam talking about? Marashdam is talking about the psak of the Ran. The Ran says that when you're bound to keep a minhag, that's only if it's a matter of Isser V'Heter. But if it's a matter of just what your parents did, you're not bound by that. Says Rav Kook, that is absolutely not true. You have to know what the Ran was talking about. The Ran was talking about a city that does something a certain way. A city that does something a certain way. And you leave the city with the intention of returning one day. At the time that you leave the city, are you bound to keep the minhagim of the city? Or do we say, no, right now I'm not in the city anymore. I only have to keep the minhag HaMakom. I'm not in that Makom right now. So the Ran says like this. if the minhag of the city that you lived in was because they were afraid of a certain isser, so then when you leave the city, you are bound to keep that minhag, provided that you're going to come back one day. But if in the city you lived in, they ate gefilte fish, so then when you leave the city, you don't have to eat gefilte fish. When you come back, you do have to eat gefilte fish. But when you leave the city, you don't have to keep gefilte fish. The Ran is talking about when you lived in a city, and now you're leaving the city, when are you bound to keep the minhagim of the city? Says the Ran, only if it's a matter of Isra. But says Rav Kook, here we're not talking about people who are leaving the city. We're talking about people in the city. And now they want to change from the way they always pronounce words to a new pronunciation. This is absolutely a violation of Al Titosh Torah Simecha. This is the way our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers pronounced the words for 1,000 years. So you're telling me it's not a matter of Isra B'Heter? Since when it's not a matter of Isra B'Heter, is there no such thing as a minhag? By the way, I'll just throw in, the Yushalmi asks a very interesting question. Yushalmi asks, there was a man by the name of Avram, but he had a name change, right? To Abraham. There's a man by the name of Yaakov. His name was changed to Yisrael. How was Yitzchak Zoicha that his name was never changed? Yitzchak never had a name changed. He was born Yitzchak, he passed away Yitzchak, never had a name change. So the Yushalmi says very good, because Hashem named him. When Hashem gives a name, you don't change the name. Says Rabbeinu B'chaye, next week's Parsha, that we find that the Psukim say that all the wells that Avraham dug and the Plishtim stuffed up, Yitzchak redug them, and he called them the same names that his father called them. Says Rabbeinu B'chaye, who could care less if he called them the same names that his father called them or different names? It matters. But Avram called one well, I don't know what. Charlie the well, thank you. Charlie the well. So Yitzchak had a choice. Should I call it Charlie? Should I call it Jimmy? Oh, Avram called it Charlie, so I'll call it Charlie also. Who cares? This is what I need. I'm learning Torah now. I need to know that Yitzchak called the same name. So it says Rabbeinu B'chai, look how important it is to maintain the customs of your father. Even when it's a matter, it's not even Torah and it makes no difference at all. Yitzchak did not want to deviate one iota from the way Abraham did things. Says Rabbeinu B'chai, even though I don't know this for sure, that could be the reason why Yitzchak was Zoicha, his name was never changed. Because he didn't want to deviate and change from the way his father did things. His name was left untouched. So Rabbeinu B'chai says. So you see, okay, now you can't bring a halacha from Rabbeinu B'chai, but you see the concept, that there is a concept of not to change even when there's not a solid halachic reason not to. But says Rav Kook, look what he writes.
Yaakov didn't deviate from his father either. I don't know.
Yeah, but we don't find specifically where Yaakov went ahead and redid the very same things that his father did in the exact same way. We don't find the Torah emphasizing that. Okay. So he says like this. He says, look in number 15. If we read the whole thing, we'll be here for another 2 years. But if we're just going to pick out a few things here. Look in the second column. That 10 lines down, the first one line is machlokes. Got it? On that line, machlokes, on the last 3 words. V'inyan zeh, when it comes to a minhag like this, ein shum chiluk beinim hadavar hu me'amin hagim sheyesh behem tzad iser. It doesn't matter if it's a minhag that has a tzad iser, oy me'advarim she'em behem ela minhaga ba'alma, or if it's just a custom, oy midid el chadchila she'em bezeh k'peda b'diavad, oy afilu midas chasidus ba'alma. Says Rav Kook, the definition of minhag, of al titosh, Torah simecha, is any valid custom. Now, if my father wore size 11 shoe, I don't have to wear the same size. Obviously, there's common sense to it. I don't have to eat the exact same things, But if something was done to enhance, now by the way, there's a very big mistake. B'chlal, the definition of minhag is not what your father did. Minhag has nothing to do with your personal father. Nothing. Minhag is what was done in the city where you're from. The city, not your parent. The city, that's the definition of minhag. Minhag Avosenu is the makkah, minhag hamakah. That's the halachic definition of minhag is, now this inyan of al titosh tar simecha, obviously, even according to this understanding, is only if it's something that enhances a mitzvah. Okay? Afilu midas chasidus ba'alma. The Ran who says, V'haran shekasav shem shenim tzaynu l'meidim etaras haminhagish kol minig isur shu b'yer achas kol minei chayom b'y minadin shenam al titas simecha shemizeh daikar harashdam b'tshuva shedav minisher sad isur shach yisrael titas simecha v'lo shem sad isur. The Ran is very clear that the only time the isur of al titosh tar simecha applies is only if you're dealing with isur v'heter and not if it's just a matter of custom. Zeh lo nemar, says Rav Kook, the Ran and the Rashtam are speaking about a limited case where you're leaving the city. Zeh lo nemar kim le'inyan shehayachid asal l'shanas says minog ir afilu k'sheyatza misham havadaite lachzer sha'az hareim b'zeh misham shinei hamachloikis. But nevertheless, huwa iser b'zeh iser atzmi because of al tidosh tar simecha. But in this case, so the Ran that says you're only obliged, you're only bound by the minhagim of the city when you leave, he's talking about when you leave the city. When you leave the city, you're only obligated to keep the minhagim that are based on Isser v'Heter. But if you remain with the Rabbim, and the Rabbim is pronouncing the words like minhag Ashkenaz, and you want to switch, even though the Rabbim is not pronouncing it for a halachic reason, just for a cultural reason, just because that's how they've been doing it, says Rav Kook, the Marashtam does not apply. It is an Isser to change. And then he adds another svara. Ready for this svara? He says like this. This is a very lamdasha point. The case of the Marashtam is like this. Even though this was a location of Ashkenazim, they started davening minhag Sfard. And then a few guys woke up and said, "What's going on? What's with minhag Ashkenaz?" And everyone else in the shul said, "Don't start up with us. This is what we're davening. Why do you want to go back? We're davening Sfard now. Bug off. You're only a few Yechidim. Bug off. This is what we're doing. The fact that 200 years ago we davened minhag Ashkenaz, we're davening minhag Sfard." So he said, you know what they said? Al titosh Torah simecha. They said, how are you Rabbim allowed to do this? But how could you forsake what our ancestors used to do? What are they trying to use Al Titosh Tar Simecha for? They're trying to use Al Titosh Tar Simecha to start a machlokes. So, says the Marashtam, you want to start a machlokes? To revert back to a minhag that's not based on Isser v'Heter. If Ashkenaz and Sfard was based on minhag of Isser v'Heter, then of course you start a machlokes to preserve a valid minhag. But this is a lower level minhag. This minhag is only based on the way things were done. The way things were done, it's important to preserve, but not to break the peace. So they were invoking Al Titosh Tar Simecha to create strife. So says the Marashtam, if it was a matter of Isser v'Heter, they could do it. But since it's a matter of only minhag ba'alma, they can't do it. But in this case, we're in Eretz Yisrael. Right now, the Ashkenazim are pronouncing the words like Ashkenazim. And now you want to say, why can't we change? So then, Al Titosh Tar Simecha is going against the Balei Machlokes. So then, of course, we apply the rule of Al Titosh Tar Simecha even when the minhag is not based on Isser v'Heter. In other words, yes, there is a concept of minhag even when it's not Isser v'Heter. But you have to know how it's being utilized. If it's trying to change the Rabbim, you can't change the Rabbim unless it's based on Isser v'Heter. But to preserve what the Rabbim is doing, even when it's not based on Isser v'Heter, Al Titosh Tar Simecha is able to preserve what the Rabbim is doing. So you got it? In other words, we have a principle of Al Titosh Tar Simecha, which the Marashtam says only applies when? By Isser v'Heter. So Rav Uzziel said, only by Isser v'Heter. So switch from whatever havar you want to the other. So Rav Kook, no. The Marashtam is talking about limited circumstance. Marashtam is talking about when you want to leave the city. When you're leaving the city, you're only bound to keep a minhag al titosh tar simecha when it's based on Isser v'Heter. That's the Ershtins. Zweitens, number two, the Marashtam is talking about going against the Rabbim. Going against the Rabbim, then al titosh tar simecha is only applicable if it's a matter of Isser v'Heter. But here, where you're trying to be oiker, the Ashkenazic Jews that are going to Eretz Yisrael, they're pronouncing the words like Ashkenazim. Now you want to change things, get them upset? When it's not a matter of, then you can, then Al Titosh Tarsimecha says, keep the way things have been going. Okay, so that's a very well-known machlokes between Rav Kook and Rav Uziel. And the Minchas Yitzchak, by the way, quotes Rav Kook, and he sides with him, right? That's what we saw in the beginning of this year. Going back to number 12. Going back to number 12. Look, the Minchas Yitzchak says, right? So it should come as a surprise that he quotes it. He says, "V'chein Pirush." It's in the first column. Harav Agon Aram Yitzchak. The country is called Torah. The Shinoi the Mifta Lagabe Acherim Nechshav B'chlal Karav Leidiktek V'Yisesa. Rav Kook adds one point, that since you're now to change from the way your parents pronounce the words, so now it is a matter of Isser V'Heter. Why? Because since this is how you have to pronounce it, pronouncing it otherwise is considered Karav Leidiktek V'Yisesa. So now it does become a matter of Karav Leidiktek V'Yisesa. So it comes out like this. The Minchas Yitzchak and Rav Kook, who are Ashkenazim, they say the Ashkenazim can't change over to Nusach Sfard. And the Sfardim, Rav Uziel, and we'll see Rabbi Vadia Yosef, they say no, the Ashkenazim could change over to the way the Sfardim pronounce the words. Okay, so that's a famous machlokes, whether it's a violation of Al Titosh Tarsimecha. Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll finish it up, and we're going to discuss the following case. And this is a very important shaila. You're in a shul, you're in an Ashkenazi shul. There are many Sfardim. You're in a Sephardi shul. There are many Ashkenazim. Now it comes a kid's bar mitzvah. He's a Sephardi. He wants to learn the Torah. Do we say, no problem, you have to do it somewhere else, but not in our shul? Right? Or, now this is that's assuming, let's say, that whatever nusach you do, we don't allow for any changes, right? Because we're going to learn that Ashkenazim should primarily have a shliach tzibur and a bal karei who reads it according to their nusach, and some vice versa. But what if you have regular people down in your shul? Are you allowed to ba'akroi have someone lein or daven not in your nusach, or make kiddush? You're going to a Sephardi's house. He makes kiddush. He has maybe 8 different words that you never heard before in your life. Are you yotzei? You hear his havdalah. Are you yotzei? Parsha Zachar. Are you yotzei? That's what we'll talk about, Mr. Shem, next week.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.